Most men in the Wild West knew the value of gold, land, and cattle, but on a cold desert night, one wandering cowboy would discover that the rarest treasure was a door that opened when he had nothing left to offer. The storm rolled across the desert like a slow gray ocean, carrying wind that rattled the dry mesquite and pushed dust across the empty plains. Miles from the nearest town, a single lantern burned in the window of a small wooden cabin near the edge of Redstone Creek. Inside lived Ayanna Redbird, a young Apache woman who had long ago learned that the quiet of the desert could be both a blessing and a warning. She moved carefully through the one-room cabin, feeding another small piece of cedar into the iron stove while the wind tapped softly against the wooden walls. Out here, nearly 15 miles from the nearest settlement, visitors were rare, and most travelers had long ago learned to avoid this stretch of land where an Apache woman lived alone. The people in town called her many things. Some said she was strange. Others said she was stubborn. A few simply called her invisible. But the desert knew her name. The creek knew her footsteps. And the old cottonwood tree beside her cabin had watched her survive more seasons than most people believed possible. That night the wind carried something different through the valley, a distant rhythm that didn't belong to the storm. Hoofbeats. Slow. Uneven. Ayanna paused beside the stove, her dark eyes lifting toward the door as the sound drifted closer through the darkness. A tired horse appeared first, its head lowered, its coat dusty from miles of travel. The rider barely remained upright in the saddle. He looked like every wandering cowboy the frontier produced by the thousands, hat pulled low, coat worn thin by sun and weather, boots carrying the dust of too many roads. The horse stopped beside the cottonwood tree as if it knew the journey had ended. The rider swayed once, then slid slowly from the saddle, landing on the hard ground with a dull thud. For a long moment the desert went quiet again, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Ayanna stepped to the door, but did not open it yet. Life on the frontier had taught her something simple. Strangers could bring trouble faster than a desert storm. Through the narrow gap in the wooden shutters, she studied the man lying beside his horse. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He wasn't calling for help. He simply lay there beneath the restless wind, breathing slow and shallow like someone who had ridden farther than his body could carry him. The horse remained beside him, calm and patient, steam rising faintly from its sides in the cold air. Ayanna hesitated only a moment longer. Somewhere deep in the silence of the desert, she remembered words her grandmother once told her beside a cooking fire many winters ago. Kindness, she had said, is the only language the land truly understands. The door creaked open into the wind. Ayanna stepped outside, the lantern light spilling across the dust. Up close the cowboy looked even more worn by travel, his coat stiff with dried mud, his face pale from exhaustion. When she knelt beside him, his eyes opened slightly, revealing a tired blue gaze that held more quiet strength than weakness. "You rode a long way," Ayanna said softly. The stranger tried to answer, but only managed a faint breath that vanished into the cold night air. Ayanna looked toward the empty horizon where the storm clouds drifted across the moon. Whoever this man was, the desert had brought him to her door. And sometimes the desert knew things people did not. She took hold of his arm and helped him slowly to his feet. Neither of them knew it yet, but before the next sunrise the quiet life of Ayanna Redbird, and the fate of an entire frontier town, would begin to change because of the simple choice she made in that moment to open her door. Ayanna Redbird had lived beside Redstone Creek for almost 6 years, long enough for the desert to memorize the rhythm of her days. When the first pale light of morning stretched across the valley, she was already awake, stepping quietly outside her cabin as the wind softened and the long shadows of the cottonwood tree stretched across the dust. The stranger still slept inside, stretched across the narrow wooden bed near the stove, breathing slow and steady after a night of deep exhaustion. She had removed his coat and placed a folded blanket over him before the fire burned low. Now the cabin smelled faintly of cedar smoke and sage tea. Ayanna moved toward the creek with a small metal bucket in her hand, the cold water rushing over smooth stones as it had long before any road had reached this valley. The nearest town, Silver Ridge, sat nearly 15 miles west along a dry wagon trail, but Ayanna rarely traveled there unless supplies became impossible to find elsewhere. The people in Silver Ridge had never quite decided what to do with her. Some said she should not be living alone on land so close to town. Others said she was harmless if left alone. Either way, she had learned to walk those streets quietly, to buy flour and coffee without lingering, and to leave before the whispers began. Years earlier, her grandmother had taught her how to read the desert the way other people read books. The color of clouds before rain, the direction of wind before winter, the quiet movements of animals before a long drought. Those lessons had kept her alive through seasons when the land gave very little. But people were harder to read than weather, especially strangers who arrived at night on tired horses. When Ayanna returned to the cabin with the bucket of water, the cowboy had shifted slightly in his sleep. His boots rested beside the bed, still dusted with pale desert sand from miles of travel. His hat hung on a wooden peg near the door. In the clearer morning light, she could see that his clothes had once been well made, though the road had worn them thin. His hands, resting loosely across the blanket, carried the quiet strength of someone used to long days in the saddle. For a moment, she wondered where he had come from. The western trails stretched hundreds of miles across plains, mountains, and desert valleys like this one. A man could ride for weeks without anyone knowing his name. Ayanna poured fresh water into a small iron kettle and set it near the stove before stepping outside again to feed the stranger's horse. The animal lifted its head slowly as she approached, watching her with calm dark eyes. It was a strong horse despite the long ride, its saddle worn but carefully maintained. Whoever the rider was, he understood the value of taking care of the animal that carried him. Ayanna brushed a handful of dry grass toward the horse and filled a shallow basin with water. The animal drank gratefully while the early sun climbed higher above the red hills. Behind her, the cabin door creaked softly as it opened. The cowboy stepped out slowly, still pale from the long journey, but steady enough to stand beneath the morning light. He looked across the quiet valley as if measuring the land itself, the creek, the cottonwood tree, the open stretch of desert beyond the hills. For a moment he said nothing. Then he turned toward Ayanna with a small nod of gratitude. "My name is Ethan," he said quietly, his voice still rough from exhaustion. Ayanna studied him carefully, noticing the calm way he carried himself despite the weariness of travel. The desert wind moved gently through the cottonwood leaves above them. She gave a small nod in return. "Ayanna," she answered. The two names hung in the quiet morning air, simple and honest. Neither of them knew yet that the desert had quietly arranged a meeting far more important than either traveler could see. The morning passed quietly beside Redstone Creek, the kind of slow frontier morning where the wind carried nothing but the smell of dry grass and the distant cry of hawks circling high above the valley. Ethan Caldwell moved carefully around the small clearing outside the cabin, testing his strength with each step while the warmth of the rising sun eased the stiffness left by his long ride. Ayanna Redbird watched him from the doorway as she stirred a pot of cornmeal over the iron stove, noticing the steady patience in the way he walked. Most travelers who passed through this part of the West carried a restless energy, always looking toward the next mile of road, but Ethan seemed different. He moved like a man who had spent many years learning how to wait. The desert wind lifted lightly through the cottonwood leaves, and the creek continued its endless conversation with the stones beneath the water. Ayanna carried 2 tin cups outside and placed them on the small wooden table beside the cabin wall. Ethan sat slowly on the rough bench nearby, accepting the cup with a quiet nod of thanks. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way most frontier coffee had to be, but he drank it slowly as though the warmth itself mattered more than the taste. "You live out here alone?" he asked after a moment, his voice calmer now than it had been the night before. Ayanna nodded once, glancing across the wide, open land surrounding her cabin. The nearest neighbor was nearly 10 miles south, an old cattle rancher who rarely traveled farther than his own fence line. Beyond that lay only miles of open desert stretching toward distant red hills. Most people preferred the noise and safety of town, but Ayanna had chosen something different. "Silver Ridge never felt like home," she said quietly. "Too many voices. Too many people who think they already know your story." Ethan studied the valley again, following the narrow line of the creek as it curved past the cottonwood and disappeared into the open plains. "It is quiet here," he said, "the kind of quiet a man can think in." Ayanna noticed the way his eyes moved over the land. not like a stranger seeing it for the first time, but like someone measuring distances, water, and wind the way experienced travelers often did. The thought made her curious. Most wandering cowboys carried little more than a saddle, a bedroll, and a few coins earned from cattle drives. But Ethan's saddle leather was well cared for despite the dust of the trail, and his horse moved with the calm discipline of an animal that had known good training. There were small details that did not quite match the story of a man simply drifting across the frontier. Later that afternoon, Ayanna stepped inside the cabin to gather the cowboy's coat, intending to brush away the dried dust from the long ride. As she lifted it from the wooden chair beside the bed, something heavy shifted in one of the inner pockets. She paused, reaching carefully into the lining until her fingers touched smooth metal. When she pulled the object into the light from the open window, the sun struck its surface with a quiet golden flash. It was a pocket watch, finely made, the kind rarely seen in remote places like this valley. The chain was strong, the metal polished, and along the back of the watch a set of small engraved letters caught the sunlight. Ayanna turned the watch slowly in her hand, studying the careful engraving as the desert wind moved gently through the open doorway behind her. Outside, Ethan Caldwell was standing beside the horse trough, filling it again with water from a wooden bucket. He looked exactly like a tired traveler who had simply ridden too far across the western trails. But the weight of the golden watch resting in Ayanna's palm suggested that the man who had arrived at her door the night before might be carrying a story far larger than either of them had spoken aloud. Ayanna Redbird stood quietly beside the open window of the cabin, the golden pocket watch resting in the center of her palm, while the afternoon sunlight slid slowly across the wooden floor. The metal was warm from the light, smooth and carefully polished, far too fine for the belongings of a man who looked as though he had spent weeks riding across dust and wind. She turned the watch again, studying the delicate engraving on the back. The letters were small but clear, carved with the careful precision of a skilled craftsman. J.C. Caldwell. The name meant nothing to her, yet something about the watch carried a quiet weight, the kind of object that traveled with men who had responsibilities larger than a saddle and a bedroll. Outside the cabin, she could hear the steady splash of water as Ethan filled the horse trough once more. The rhythm of the bucket rising and falling echoed through the warm air, simple and steady, like the sound of someone who had done the same task 1,000 times before. Ayanna closed the watch slowly and slipped it back into the coat pocket exactly where she had found it. The desert had taught her many things, and one of those lessons was patience. Some stories revealed themselves only when the wind changed direction. When she stepped outside again, the late afternoon sun was already leaning toward the western hills, casting long amber shadows across the clearing. Ethan stood beside the cottonwood tree, resting one hand lightly on the neck of his horse. The animal seemed calmer now, its strength returning after a night of rest and water. "You should not stay on your feet too long yet," Ayanna said as she approached, her voice calm but firm. "The body needs time after a hard ride." Ethan gave a small smile that carried more quiet gratitude than humor. "I have had harder rides than that one," he replied, though his voice still held a trace of weariness. Ayanna studied him for a moment. The wind brushed gently through his hair, and for the first time she noticed the way he watched the horizon rather than the ground. It was the habit of a man used to thinking about distance, about where a road might lead long before his horse ever reached it. Most travelers who passed through Silver Ridge spoke loudly about where they had been. Ethan did the opposite. He spoke very little about the miles behind him. That silence told its own kind of story. The evening air cooled slowly as the sun lowered behind the red hills. Ayanna carried another kettle of water toward the small cooking fire beside the cabin, while Ethan remained near the trough, watching the valley grow quiet. After a few minutes he spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "Silver Ridge is the nearest town, correct?" "About 15 miles west," Ayanna answered. "The trail follows the creek for the first 6 miles. After that it climbs into the hills." Ethan nodded slightly, as if storing the information somewhere deeper than simple memory. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The cottonwood leaves whispered softly overhead, while the first pale colors of sunset touched the edges of the sky. Finally Ethan looked toward her again. "You were not afraid to open your door last night," he said quietly. "Most people would have waited for morning." Ayanna placed another piece of cedar wood onto the fire, and watched the small flames rise slowly around it. "The desert does not send strangers without reason," she said. "Sometimes the land brings someone who needs help, and sometimes it brings someone who carries a story that has not finished traveling yet." Ethan listened without answering, his expression calm but thoughtful as the wind drifted across the valley. Neither of them noticed the faint dust line far beyond the western hills where the long trail from Silver Ridge began, a thin ribbon of movement slowly growing against the fading light of evening. The desert night settled slowly across the valley like a quiet blanket, bringing cooler air that moved gently through the cottonwood leaves above Ayanna Redbird's cabin. The fire beside the small cooking pit burned low, its soft glow reflecting in the calm water of Redstone Creek, while the wide sky above filled with more stars than most towns ever noticed. Ethan Caldwell sat on the wooden bench near the cabin wall, holding a tin cup of coffee between his hands while the warmth from the fire eased the chill that followed the sunset. Ayanna added another piece of cedar to the flames and watched the sparks rise slowly into the dark sky. Out here the nights were rarely silent. The wind spoke through the grass, owls called from the distant hills, and the creek whispered its endless path through the valley. Yet the quiet between two people who had only just met carried its own kind of conversation. Ethan studied the firelight for a moment before speaking. "You have lived here a long time," he said gently. Ayanna nodded. "Long enough to know which winters will be harsh and which summers will be dry. Long enough to know when a traveler has ridden farther than he planned." Ethan smiled slightly at that, the expression calm but thoughtful. "Sometimes a road becomes longer than a man expects." Ayanna noticed that he chose his words carefully, the way a person might when carrying memories that were not easily explained. The golden pocket watch remained hidden inside his coat, hanging quietly on the peg inside the cabin, but its presence had already changed the way she listened to his voice. Men who carried watches like that rarely wandered without purpose. The fire crackled softly while the moon climbed above the eastern ridge. For a while neither of them spoke. Ethan seemed content simply watching the desert around him, as if committing every shadow and every line of the valley to memory. Finally, he glanced toward Ayanna again. "Do you ever travel into Silver Ridge?" he asked. "Only when supplies are needed," she answered. "Flour, coffee, sometimes tools. The town does not welcome Apache visitors for long conversations." Ethan nodded slowly as if the answer did not surprise him. Many towns forget that the land they stand on belonged to someone long before the first wooden buildings appeared. His voice carried no anger, only a quiet observation that seemed to come from long years of watching the frontier change. Ayanna studied him again, noticing the calm confidence that remained in his posture even when he spoke softly. Most cowboys she had met carried themselves with restless energy, always eager for the next trail or the next paycheck. Ethan carried something different. It was the stillness of a man accustomed to decisions that stretched beyond a single day. The fire burned lower while the night deepened around them. Somewhere beyond the western hills a faint echo of distant hooves drifted through the darkness, too far away to disturb the quiet valley, but close enough to remind the desert that travelers still moved along its long roads. Ethan listened for a moment before his attention returned to the fire. "The frontier is changing faster every year," he said quietly. "New rail lines, new towns, new roads cutting across land that used to belong only to the wind." Ayanna looked toward the horizon where the stars touched the distant hills. "The land remembers what came before," she replied softly. "Even when people forget." Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly, watching the slow glow of the fire, as if considering the truth in her words. Neither of them noticed that the faint dust line beyond the western hills had grown larger since sunset, slowly moving closer along the long trail that led from Silver Ridge toward the quiet cabin beside Redstone Creek. The desert night slowly surrendered to the pale blue light of dawn, and the first warmth of the rising sun crept across the valley surrounding Ayanna Redbird's cabin. A faint mist hovered above Redstone Creek while the cottonwood leaves stirred softly in the early morning breeze. Ayanna was already awake, standing beside the small cooking fire where a kettle of water warmed above the quiet flames. The smell of coffee drifted through the cool air as the sky brightened behind the eastern hills. Ethan Caldwell stepped outside the cabin a few minutes later, moving more easily now that his strength had returned after a night of deep rest. He paused beside the doorway for a moment, taking in the peaceful stretch of land that surrounded the cabin. The desert looked calm in the morning light, as if the entire valley had decided to rest after the long, whispering wind of the night before. Ayanna handed him a tin cup filled with coffee, and he accepted it with the same quiet gratitude he had shown since arriving. "You rise early," he said after a moment, watching the creek flow steadily past the cottonwood tree. "The land rises early," Ayanna answered. "If you wait too long, the day moves ahead without you." Ethan nodded slightly, understanding the wisdom in her words. For a while they stood together in silence, the only sound coming from the gentle flow of water and the occasional call of a distant hawk circling above the red hills. Then Ethan's eyes moved toward the western horizon, narrowing slightly, as though he had noticed something that did not belong to the quiet morning. At first Ayanna saw nothing except the wide stretch of open land that led towards Silver Ridge. But after a few seconds she noticed it too. A thin ribbon of dust slowly rising against the distant trail, far beyond the bend of the creek where the wagon road disappeared into the hills. "Travelers," Ethan said quietly, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The dust line grew gradually larger as the sun climbed higher, revealing several riders moving together along the trail from Silver Ridge. Ayanna watched them carefully, her expression calm but thoughtful. Visitors were uncommon this far from town, especially in the early hours of the morning. Ethan lowered his cup slowly, his attention fixed on the approaching riders with the steady focus of a man who understood that some arrivals carried more meaning than others. "Perhaps they are only passing through," Ayanna said, though she knew the trail did not continue beyond the valley unless someone intended to reach the cabin or the small grazing land near the creek. The riders moved closer, their shapes becoming clearer against the brightening sky. There were 4 of them, riding strong horses that carried polished saddles and travel packs that suggested a long journey rather than a short visit from town. One of the men wore a dark coat that caught the sunlight as his horse stepped onto the lower part of the trail leading into the valley. Ethan stood quietly beside the cottonwood tree, his posture calm but attentive. For a moment he seemed to consider something privately before speaking again. "If they ask about me," he said gently, "tell them you have not seen anyone ride through here." Ayanna studied his face, noticing the seriousness behind his calm voice. She had already sensed that Ethan Caldwell carried a story larger than he had chosen to share, and now the approaching riders confirmed that feeling. The desert wind moved softly through the valley as the men continued down the trail, their horses stepping steadily toward the quiet cabin beside Redstone Creek. Whatever road Ethan had traveled before arriving here had clearly not ended with the storm that brought him to Ayanna's door. The 4 riders approached slowly along the narrow trail that followed the curve of Redstone Creek, their horses stepping carefully through the pale dust that had not yet settled from the long ride out of Silver Ridge. The morning sun had climbed higher now, casting sharp golden light across the valley and revealing every movement against the wide open land. Ayanna Redbird stood beside the cottonwood tree with quiet stillness, while Ethan Caldwell remained a few steps behind her near the cabin wall, his posture relaxed but watchful. The riders were close enough now for details to become clear. Their horses were strong and well cared for, their saddles polished, and the men themselves carried the confident posture of travelers who were used to being obeyed when they asked questions. The man in front wore a dark coat despite the warming day, and a silver watch chain glimmered faintly against his vest as his horse slowed near the edge of the clearing. The group stopped several yards from the cabin, and for a moment none of them spoke. The wind moved gently through the cottonwood leaves above, while Redstone Creek continued its steady murmur behind the small cabin. Finally the man in the dark coat tipped his hat politely toward Ayanna. "Good morning, miss," he said in a measured voice that carried across the clearing without any need for raised volume. "We are looking for someone who may have passed through this valley last night." Ayanna met his gaze calmly, her expression unreadable as the desert wind brushed lightly across her dark hair. "Travelers pass through these lands sometimes," she answered evenly. "The road from Silver Ridge runs many miles through the hills." The man nodded as if the answer confirmed something he had already expected. "Perhaps you noticed a rider on a gray horse," he continued. "Tall man, worn coat. He would have looked like he had ridden a long distance." Ayanna paused for just a moment before replying. "I saw no rider pass my cabin last night." The man studied her carefully, not with suspicion, but with the thoughtful patience of someone who understood that the truth sometimes arrived slowly in quiet places like this valley. Behind him, one of the other riders shifted slightly in his saddle, scanning the area around the cabin as if hoping to find signs of recent travel. Ayana remained calm, her posture steady and her voice unchanged. After a moment, the man in the dark coat gave a small nod of appreciation. "Thank you for your time, miss," he said politely. "If you happen to see such a rider, it would be helpful if word reached Silver Ridge." Ayana inclined her head slightly, but said nothing more. The riders lingered only a few seconds longer before turning their horses back toward the trail. The sound of hooves faded slowly as they rode away, the dust from their departure drifting lazily through the morning light. For several moments after they disappeared beyond the bend in the valley, neither Ayana nor Ethan spoke. The quiet returned to the clearing as naturally as the breeze returning to the cottonwood leaves. Finally, Ethan stepped forward beside her, his voice low and thoughtful. "You did not have to do that." Ayana looked out toward the distant hills where the riders had vanished from view. "Sometimes the desert asks us to choose who we help and who we send away," she replied softly. Ethan studied her face with quiet respect before glancing once more toward the long, empty trail stretching toward Silver Ridge. Whatever road had followed him to this valley had clearly not reached its final destination yet. The valley grew quiet again after the riders disappeared beyond the western bend of the trail, leaving only the soft whisper of Redstone Creek and the slow rustle of cottonwood leaves above Ayana Redbird's cabin. The morning sun continued to climb across the sky, spreading warm light across the open desert, while the long shadows of early dawn faded into the pale dust of the clearing. For a time, neither Ayana nor Ethan Caldwell spoke. Both of them watched the empty trail as though expecting the riders to suddenly return, but the horizon remained still. Eventually, Ethan released a slow breath and stepped away from the cabin wall, walking toward the creek where the water moved calmly over the smooth stones. Ayana followed a few steps behind, her eyes studying him carefully. The quiet confidence he carried had not changed since the riders arrived, yet there was something different in the way he looked toward the western hills now. It was the look of a man who understood that a chapter of his journey had reached its end. "I should not stay here any longer," Ethan said finally, his voice calm but certain. "The men who came this morning will return to Silver Ridge. They will tell others what they saw and what they did not find. It will only be a matter of time before more riders follow the same trail." Ayana stood beside the creek, watching the sunlight ripple across the water. The desert had taught her that every traveler eventually continued down the road that called to them. Still, the quiet valley already felt different, knowing the stranger would soon leave it behind. "You have only just regained your strength," she replied gently. "Another day of rest would not harm anyone." Ethan smiled faintly, but the expression carried a hint of distance now, as though his thoughts had already moved far beyond the valley. "Some roads do not allow a man to rest very long," he answered. Ayana studied him in silence for a moment before asking the question she had held since discovering the golden pocket watch. "Those men were not searching for a wandering cowboy, were they?" Ethan looked down at the flowing water before answering. "No," he said quietly. "They were searching for someone who left Silver Ridge 3 days ago under circumstances that created concern among certain business partners." He lifted his eyes toward the red hills stretching across the horizon. "My full name is Ethan Caldwell," he continued calmly. "The Caldwell Rail Company has been building new lines across the Western Territories for more than a decade. Sometimes men who work in large companies forget that trust travels slower than money." Ayana listened without interruption as the pieces of the story settled into place. The watch, the trained horse, the careful way he studied the land. All of it now made sense. Yet none of those things had changed the man who had arrived exhausted at her door during the storm. "You rode all the way here to leave them behind," she said softly. Ethan nodded once. "I needed time to think without the noise of boardrooms, contracts, and decisions that affect towns I have never even seen." His gaze moved slowly across the valley one last time. "This place gave me that silence." The wind passed gently through the cottonwood leaves while the creek continued its endless path through the desert. Ayana felt no surprise, only a quiet understanding. That the land sometimes brought strangers together so they could remember something important before continuing their journeys. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the golden watch, turning it thoughtfully in the sunlight before closing the lid with a soft click. By tomorrow morning, he said calmly, the men who rode away from here today will realize they were searching in the wrong direction. And when that happens, the road ahead will begin to look very different for everyone who believed they already knew my story. The sun was already leaning toward the western hills by the time evening returned to the quiet valley beside Redstone Creek. The day had passed slowly, as desert days often did, with the steady rhythm of wind through dry grass and the gentle murmur of water sliding across smooth stones. Iona Redbird stood beside the cottonwood tree, watching the long stretch of trail that led towards Silver Ridge. Ethan Caldwell had spent most of the afternoon repairing a loose strap on his saddle and brushing the dust from his horse, preparing for the road that would soon call him away from the small cabin that had sheltered him during the storm. The desert carried a quiet understanding between travelers and the land. No one truly owned the road. They only borrowed it for a time. As the sky turned shades of gold and amber, Ethan stepped beside the creek one last time, his boots resting on the same smooth stones where he had stood the previous morning. He looked across the valley with calm eyes, as if committing the peaceful place to memory before continuing the journey that had followed him here. Iona approached quietly, carrying a small cloth bundle tied with twine. Inside were dried herbs and bread she had prepared earlier in the afternoon. For the road, she said simply as she handed it to him. Ethan accepted the bundle with a quiet nod, the same quiet gratitude that had marked every word between them since the storm had first brought him to her door. The desert wind moved gently across the clearing, stirring the cottonwood leaves above them, while the first evening stars began to appear. I did not come here expecting kindness, Ethan said after a moment. Many places in the West have forgotten how simple kindness can be. Iona looked toward the fading horizon where the trail disappeared between the hills. The land remembers even when people forget, she replied softly. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and removed the golden watch one last time, the polished metal catching the final light of the setting sun. He studied it for a moment before returning it to the pocket with a quiet click. Tomorrow the men from Silver Ridge will realize their mistake, he said thoughtfully. They will understand that the man they were searching for did not vanish into the desert. He simply chose a different road for a little while. Iona nodded but said nothing. She had already sensed that whatever future waited for Ethan Caldwell would reach far beyond the quiet valley beside Redstone Creek. Yet the man standing beside her now still carried the same calm presence of the tired traveler she had helped the night of the storm. Ethan lifted the saddle onto his horse and secured the straps with practiced ease before placing one boot into the stirrup. He paused for a moment before mounting, looking toward Iona with a thoughtful expression. If the rail lines ever reach this valley, he said gently, I hope they bring people who understand the value of the land they travel across. Iona smiled faintly. The desert has a way of teaching those lessons, she said. Some travelers simply need time to hear them. Ethan nodded once more before guiding the horse toward the narrow trail beside the creek. The animal stepped forward calmly, carrying him slowly toward the western hills where the fading sunlight painted the horizon in deep amber light. Iona watched until the rider and horse became smaller against the wide desert landscape. Eventually the trail turned behind a ridge, and Ethan Caldwell disappeared from view just as quietly as he had arrived. The valley returned to its familiar stillness as the evening wind brushed gently across Redstone Creek. Somewhere beyond the distant hills, railroads would continue stretching across the frontier, and towns would continue growing where once there had been only open land. Yet the desert would always remember the night a wandering traveler found shelter in a small cabin beside a cottonwood tree, and the quiet kindness that had followed him back onto the long road west.